If there's one area of the lore that fascinates me more than most, it is the Great War between the Aesir and Vanir, the first war in the world. It's not hard to imagine how this would be a colossal, important, realm-shattering event. Yet, despite that, we get basically 3 or so stanzas, which is par for the course in heathenry. We know why that is. After all, the skalds of the time made assumptions on the base level of knowledge held by their audience. Why wax poetic about something that the audience was already well versed in? The greater story was more important, rather than deep dives into specific events. This is why we often get one-sentence explanations for tantalizing details that have since been lost. For example, the reason Freyja received half of the chosen dead was probably at one point or another common knowledge, so it didn't need anything other than the briefest of mentions, a touchstone, a recognition of the greater landscape. Which, of course, irks us now, but its absence, in a way, speaks volumes on the sort of collective and shared cultural identity and the nature of the Viking Age oral tradition. All that being said, what do we have? Let's have a look. The war I remember, the first in the world, when the gods with spears had smitten Gulveig, and in the hall of Hor had burned her, 3 times burned and 3 times born, oft and again, yet ever she lives. Hath they named her, who sought their home, the wide-seeing witch, in magic wise. Minds she bewitched, that were moved by her magic. To evil women a joy she was. The scene has been set. We have an inciting incident, though one which itself raises more questions than answers. Chief among them, a question which we still debate to this day, who is Gulveig? Because here we have a central figure, the being whose mistreatment broke whatever treaty or peace the Aesir and Vanir enjoyed previously. She's clearly someone who is important to the latter, yet her identity or relation to the Vanir remains a total mystery. So, who is she? We have a few options. The most popular theory is that Gulveig is Freyja, and you can easily see how that conclusion is drawn. Freyja, after all, is the daughter of Njortha, who holds a central role, we can gather, within the Vanir. Her mistreatment at the hands of the Aesir would, for all intents and purposes, be akin to a princess of another land being tortured within Asgardian walls. She too is explicitly stated in the Heimskringla to be a proficient saith worker, like Gulveig. Gulveig as a name has etymological connections to gold, golden drink, golden power, golden intoxication, words to that effect. And Freyja too has a connection to gold through various kennings, with gold and wealth being almost uniquely tied to the Vanir and their sphere of associations. There's an interesting theory touted by Britt-Mari Nasstrom in Freyja, Great Goddess of the North, that suggests that Freyja was tasked with infiltrating the Aesir and weakening them from within, and being tortured upon her discovery. I find that interesting, if only because it puts the Vanir in a less reactive role, with ramifications and various rabbit holes we can go down if we were to run with that being true. This also falls nicely into my personal, I don't want to say theory as I'm far from married to it, so let's go with potential thought bubble, that verse 21 and 22 may not be in chronological order. That is to say that there was a witch named Hath, and was considered evil and all of that. She was discovered by the Aesir and then tortured, and there she remained, within Asgard's walls. Pin that in your brain for a moment as I'll touch on it again later. The other prominent theory is that Angerbotha is Gulveig. After all, by the time we meet her later on, she is clearly a proficient magic user and is frequently called Evil, the mother of monsters, she who brings sorrow. Unlike the Aesir, the Vanir seemingly have no quarrel or qualms with the Jotnar, so indeed, perhaps her torture and attempted murder, an unjust act, would be enough for war to break out. Equally, like the Jotnar, the Vanir practice magic and would also see Gulveig's magical practice as not warranting torture and death. Further, and this one is more of a leap between connecting all of the dots, we do have a Heith or Heida that is mentioned in Hyndluljóð as being the daughter of Hrymnir. In Volsungasaga, we have Hrymnir's daughter being first a handmaiden of Frigg, and then a traveller on Midgard, offering aid in the pursuit of fertility through magical means. Here she doesn't go by Heid or Heith, but by Hjolth, called Wish Maiden of Odin. You can start to see some similarities between Gulveig Heid and Heid mentioned here. She who offers aid, practices magic, and travels the realms. We can take this one step further. If this Heith or Heida was a handmaiden to Frigg, then perhaps she was also a handmaiden to Freyja, especially if we are to assume they're in fact the same goddess. This is reinforced by the prevalent idea that the Mengloth mentioned in Fjölsvinnsmál is Freyja herself, with Mengloth meaning essentially necklace bearer. And Mengloth has 9 handmaidens, one of which is Obotha, very similar to Angabotha, who is attested twice to be the mother of Gertha. That name may be familiar to you, as that is the name of Freyja's wife. All that is to say that potentially, and that's a big potentially, Gulveig is Angabotha and the daughter of Hrymnir, Heith, who is in turn the mother of Gertha, and mother-in-law to Freyja, and previous handmaiden to Freyja, which would go some way to explain why the Vanir reacted so strongly to Gulveig's torture at the hands of the Aesir. They were essentially protecting their own family, driven to pursue Wergild at her mistreatment. There's more supporting attestations that carry themselves forward in the timeline, but that goes too into the weeds for this video. I'll leave it for a future breakdown. Alternatively, we could all be doing some incredible mental gymnastics, and Gulveig is in fact either the seeress speaking the prophecy, who could also be Angabotha or Freyja, or some third-party individual who pops up and then disappears again, which is something that should be considered as much as that is unsatisfactory for the puzzle solvers among us. Ultimately, it's absolutely up for interpretation, and there's no wrong answer. What we can say is that Gulveig was important enough to the Vanir as to start a war over. Then all the powers went to the judgment seats, the very holy gods, and discussed this, whether the Aesir should pay a fine, or all the gods should have a tribute. That was yet the battle of armies, the first one in the world. Odin let fly and shot into the army. The shield wall of the fortress of the Aesir was broken. The battle-wise Vanir knew how to tread the field. Following the previous stanza, the narrative seems to follow that the Vanir were after Wergild for Gulveig's torture. What is interesting is that Bellows in his translation moves the order of the stanzas to infer that the Great War has already happened. The Vanir succeeded, and then all the powers went to the judgment seats to discuss whether the Aesir should allow for equal rights of worship or pay tribute to the Vanir on the back of their victory. If we let the commonly stated order stand, though, whatever discussion occurred between the two tribes of gods were ultimately fruitless, and war was seen as the only way forward. And so we have the image of Odin, standing at the forefront of an Aesir army, standing in opposition to the Vanir host. If we're to assume mortal boundaries and mortal rules and not some godly inter-realm fantastical battlefield, it seems this war, or this battle, takes place in Asgard, with the Aesir meeting the Vanir outside their walls. Odin throws a spear over the forces, signalling that the battle was to start. This is quite an old, ritualistic element of battle, or indeed declaring war, something that perseveres across cultures. In ancient Rome, there was a practice that you would declare war by throwing a spear across a boundary. It was a very deliberate act, and only one done through provocation. This also carries through into the Viking Age, and we have attestations that suggest it was customary to throw a spear over enemy territory and forces, to claim the battle land and soon to be dead for Odin. The spear is also symbolic of Odin, almost uniquely tied to him. Nonetheless, despite the Aesir mastery of martial combat and physical prowess, The Vanir break their walls and, by all accounts, overwhelm Asgardian efforts to put together a sufficient defence. Other academics have proposed that it was the Vanir's mastery of magic that served as the deciding factor. And that would, in my opinion, be a sound conclusion, with Ursula Dronke going forward to suggest that the Vanir practiced magic that could resurrect the dead. Saether. Now that's interesting for a plethora of reasons, and it's again a larger conversation than this video, but needless to say, it leads to a fascinating rabbit hole or two. It has also been suggested that it is immediately after the Great War that the mysterious Builder arrives in Asgard in an offer to rebuild the walls that have been damaged, and the gods once again sought their assembly seats to debate the bargain proposed by the Jotun at their gate. But let's go back to the point I mentioned earlier, in that we have a theory that Freyja as Gullveig remained among the Aesir as a hostage within their walls. You can easily imagine why the Vanir want to break down their walls in an effort to try to rescue Njortha's daughter. It's interesting that while we have little in the way of detail for the events of the war, we have that inclusion, something very specific, that they broke down the walls. This might also explain why, during the hostage exchange that occurred between the two factions, that Freyja finds herself among the Aesir despite not being listed alongside her father and brother as Vanir hostages. She was already living there, maybe not as a hostage this time, but as a guest and treated with guest rights. We know Odin courted Saether, and that she taught him the art. It'd be easy to see how that wouldn't be within the usual framework of hostage and prisoner, but of guest and host. It might also explain why we have two presumably prominent Vanir offered as hostages where, and no offence to Mimir and Honir, but they're not exactly the presumed leaders of the Aesir. Because Freyja was already in Asgard, and they might have preferred to go in person to ensure her safety and treatment rather than send representatives. There's also the idea of Gullveig undergoing a transformation through her ordeal, whether that be into the goddess we eventually see as Freyja, or Angerbotha, or a mysterious third party. Maria Kvilhaug fleshes out that idea in the Seeds of Yggdrasil, if that is of any interest to those listening. The Great War is the story of how two warring factions, two warring tribes of gods, were united into a single pantheon. But for us heathens, it's a story that raises more questions than it answered, with numerous paths to go down in terms of reading between the lines and offering more insight into the machinations, relationships, and histories of our gods. Even within the sparse information we do have, there's ample room to ponder, infer, and attempt to read between the lines. That's one of my absolutely favourite things to do, to follow threads to see where they lead, and here we have a veritable bounty of threads and possibilities. But I'll leave that here for now. I hope you enjoyed listening. I hope you all have a fantastic week. See you.